So I'm going to start with the basic growth curve of animals. And Dr. Fred Owens published a paper in the Journal of Animal Science a few years ago that really highlights the growth curve of, he did it in cattle, but the basic principles work for humans, pigs, horses, dogs. And the basic principle is that muscle grows at a decreasing rate. And so if you look at my red line here, we're born with a large quantity of muscle at birth, and that muscle increases, but it increases at a slowing or decreasing rate. Okay? You would have recognized that in your body. Fat, in the green line, increases at an increasing rate. That's the whole point of cattle feeding. You would have also recognized that in your body. Unfortunately.
A little bit.
Right. But that's the basic premise of cattle feeding, is that fat growth increases at an increasing rate. And in the blue line, bone growth is very linear and proportional to weight. So even as I've gotten heavier, I haven't probably grown any since about 20 or 21, as I've gotten heavier, my bones have actually gotten heavier because bone remodels and becomes more dense as an animal's mass increases. The same can be said for cattle.
What about decreasing if you lose weight?
That's right. Bone will also remodel and lose density. That's right. In old age, in senescence. That does occur as well. So I'm going to break down growth and then destruction into two basic components. The first is anabolism. And this steer is well finished. And we would probably not argue that this steer was in a growth phase. And the buildup of body tissues is anabolism. And so you see I've listed there 4 hormones. Insulin, IGF-1, which is insulin-like growth factor 1, testosterone, and estrogen. All 4 of those hormones at vastly different levels would have been flowing through that animal. Now, we could all argue that once we removed his testicles, the flow of testosterone and estrogen would have been nil. Extremely minimal. Insulin and IGF-1, they're always there. Insulin is primarily going to be part of the fat growth mechanism, and IGF-1 is going to be mostly into muscle growth. But all 4 hormones are going to cause anabolism, or the building up of that animal's body tissues. And you kind of back to last night's discussion on live animal growth, this guy doesn't have very many muscular definition points anymore. It's all relatively smooth, it's all relatively finished, and when we killed him, he was a yield grade 4 steer. Well finished. In contrast, back to this gentleman's point, we can break down body components. This cow, arguably a cull cow that likely should have been culled previous to this picture being taken, she was in catabolism for survival. So she is breaking down body components to simply stay alive. I did not see this cow's carcass, but I have seen the carcasses of cows from ones that look just like that. And I'm going to draw you a little picture, and it kind of illustrates things that I've seen. So I'll blow this up a little bit here, if I can. Maybe I won't draw you a picture. Dr. Tennant, do you think we have another one? Right there. So, there we go. When you go over to the meat lab, you're going to see a ribeye on a carcass. And the ribeye is generally going to look like that. There's going to be a nice layer of fat around that ribeye. And it's going to look something like that, okay? Obviously blown up. In a cow, like you might see above, that same vision might be something like this. The smallest ribeye I've ever seen on a bovine was in a cull cow, and it looked about like that when we ribbed it. And it was 2.4 square inches. So she had gone through catabolism to stay alive. And those hormones, cortisol, glucagon, adrenaline, had been coursing through her body to break down body components, muscle, tissue, bone, simply to keep the body systems running. Okay, a traditional growth curve is something that we call a sigmoidal growth curve, shown here. So we have prenatal growth, and so let's talk about a calf. So if we have a calf, we have a cell where the sperm and egg meet, and that is fundamentally weightless in the beginning. And let's say that we have an 80-pound calf born. So there was definitely growth during gestation. And then that growing calf, once it's born, is in an accelerated growth phase. That's at the cow-calf level, at the stocker level, at the feedlot level. And that's where the greatest opportunity for financial reward is. And then in the end, we have decelerated growth. Our fed cattle typically never get there. Decelerated growth is commonly only seen in the cull mature cow. So you have a cow that weighs 1,200 pounds at maturity, and then as she starts to reach the end of her productive life, she starts to lose condition, and she weighs 11, and then she weighs 10, and then she weighs 9, and hopefully somebody sells her before she looks like the cow in the last slide. Okay? Look at that guy. That's a tremendous growth. Tremendous growth. So this was a cannulated steer that we had locally. So this steer had been growing for 5 years. One of my colleagues, Dr. Mike Brown, at the time he ran our university feedlot, and he was using this cannulated steer for rumen microbiology, rumen growth experiments, and he was at the end of his useful life. He weighed 3,100 pounds when we killed him. And he had an 1,800-pound carcass. We had to cut it into eighths to get it into the meat lab. We couldn't kill him in the meat lab because he was too large to come in the door. So we shot him at the feedlot and dressed him in the Sweet Brand Bay. But what I want you to notice here, okay, there's a couple of things. Number one, he's amaturity, which would be completely unexpected with our logic about age and growth physiology. He was a 5-year-old steer. But the maturity system that our grading is based on is solely caused by the ossification of bone. The ossification of bone is driven by one hormone, estrogen. What did we do with that steer's estrogen? Removed it, right? And arguably, a steer in a feedlot, the only source of estrogen is the minimal part that's in their ear. And it will move bone maturity about 10 degrees, say from an A50 to an A60, not to a dramatic degree. So he had all permanent teeth. He was 5 years old, an A-maturity steer, and he was high prime. But he was also a yield grade 9. We only go to 5, but in a multiple linear equation, you can just keep trucking, and he's actually a yield grade 9. So there was tremendous growth in that animal. Now, we talk about a steer being done, and I talked about that last night. One concept I'll ask you to remember, a steer, and I can say the same for an overectomized heifer, will grow until their intake, their dry matter intake in calories, equals their maintenance energy requirements. And that is at a weight and an age much heavier and much older than we think about today, at least in our system. Probably heavier and older than you think about in your systems. And so this Angus steer was at 3,100. I don't know that he was done growing. And I say that because this past summer, I should have added this slide to my set here. This last summer, I was at a feed yard in Washington State, and that feed yard had a 7-year-old steer that they thought weighed 3,800. And he was larger than this guy. And he was just in a pen. And he was kind of a pet and kind of a hobby and kind of a curiosity. How big can a steer get? And he just kept growing and growing and growing and growing. And I've got a similar version of this going on at home right now. I have a goat that I'm feeding. I've been feeding this goat for 5 years to see how big a goat can get. And he's about this tall. And he weighs about 350 right now. He's a big goat. Oh yeah, a weather goat. But the point is, a castrate animal will grow until their intake equals their maintenance requirements, because there's no signal from estrogen to stop bone growth. And that's the signal that the bones are waiting for. Okay, so back to muscle growth. Muscle growth occurs in 2 forms prenatally: hyperplasia, and hyperplasia is the increase in cell number, and hypertrophy, an increase in cell size. Now realize that cells grow in 2 dimensions. Fundamentally, they grow radially. The cells become larger in diameter as protein is accrued, and the cells become longer in length, and that is to foster bone growth and to allow and support bone growth. Postnatally, once the animal is born, hypertrophy is the only option. An animal is born with the number of cells, muscle cells, it will die with. So I was born with the same number of muscle cells that I have today, and then the same number of muscle cells that I'll die with. You do not gain new muscle cells after birth. Multiple factors affect hyperplasia. Okay? We'll start with muscle size. The ones that control an eyelid are much smaller and different than the ones that control your legs. There's just sheer mass difference. Species has a huge difference. Elephants and mice would be a good example. Cattle and pigs are a good example. Within cattle, sex is a big deal. Males, the bull and then the castrate, always have more muscle fibers than the like female. Okay? Prenatal nutrition, you see a runt pig has fewer fibers than a normal littermate. Selection, our domestic pigs have a large diameter loini today. If you've ever shot a wild pig, they have a small diameter loini, many fewer muscle fibers. And we've got some genetic mutations here, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. So, you've probably seen something that look like that, right? A Belgian blue or a Piedmontese. We call those double-muscled cattle. They don't technically have 2 muscles. They approximately have twice the number of muscle fibers. Okay? A little data for you. If we were to compare an Angus versus a Belgian blue eye of round, I don't know what term that would be in many of your countries. That's the semitendinosus muscle worldwide. 1.7 versus 3.4 million fibers. Okay? Big difference, big difference. And those animals, they look different phenotypically. The carcasses also look different, and that's a simple gene mutation. That would be a carcass from a Belgian blue. Extremely lean, extremely heavy muscled. No fat, but very tender. Very tender. Maybe very bland. At least not a traditional fat flavor.
But no marbling as well.
No marbling. No marbling. And so one point that I'll make, in our U.S. feeder cattle grading system, double-muscled animals, namely a Piedmontese or a Belgian Blue, are considered inferior. So in feeder cattle grading, we have a system where we estimate their frame score, small, medium, large, and their muscle score, 1, 2, 3, 4. And those are common marketing points that the USDA reports daily to the industry. If a double-muscled animal were to walk into a market, they would mark that animal as inferior for the reason that it will never grade choice at any weight, because they won't deposit fat, intramuscular fat, in the ribeye. And so, just to summarize this, a fantastically high dressed yield, very minimal fat cover, huge quantities of muscle, and a fantastic muscle to bone ratio. A fantastic muscle to bone ratio. All right, I'll move to hypertrophy, or an increase in cell size, cell diameter, and cell length. So we've got longitudinal growth, which is the length, radial growth, which is the diameter. Most of the growth is radial, dramatically more, fundamentally about 4 times that of the longitudinal growth. Bulls have more diameter than steers, again driven by testosterone. Nutrition has a huge effect in that, and we have growth-promoting compounds now, and our congregation from Mexico would be very familiar with those, beta agonists, that we can use to improve muscle hypertrophy. So, in the top right, the black baldy is a control or negative animal that did not receive a beta agonist. The red baldy in the lower left received zilpaterol hydrochloride for 20 days, not 30 days, but received it for 20 days. And tell me, do you notice a difference in its musculature?
Yeah.
Sure. Primarily in the hindquarter. So if we look at the sirloin's right here, at the top of the tail head, and if we look at the round, there's a noticeable difference in those two hindquarters. And that's a very repeatable effect that we have seen and published many times over. And it's caused by a change in radial cell diameter. So the cattle didn't get taller, they didn't get longer, but the muscles became more radially plump in those 20 or so days. And the same can be seen in the muscle cuts. These two strip loins are actually from Holsteins. So a control Holstein on the left and a Holstein that was fed zilpaterol on the right. And so those are some of the carcass outcomes: higher dressed yield, heavier carcass weight, less fat, less ribeye, lower yield grade, less marbling, higher red meat yield, less carcass waste fat and less waste bone, not because they produce less fat and less bone, but because it was diluted out by more muscle. Okay? So those are hypertrophic effects. Okay, so let's get out of muscle growth and switch to fat growth. Ruminant on the left, monogastric on the right. So fundamentally, when we feed a ruminant, we're not feeding the animal, we're feeding a fermentation vat. And I don't need to tell most of you that. Many of you are fantastically well educated in what I'm talking about. We feed a fermentation vat, and we're generating volatile fatty acids, which are the energy source of the animal. Those VFAs, namely acetate, butyrate, and propionate, are produced by the bacterial vat, absorbed in the papilla of the rumen, and the animal uses those for energy. Okay? Non-ruminants, like us, have a little different system. We eat a heavy meal, like maybe we had some breakfast scones out here. Our blood sugar increases. Our body says, hey, your blood sugar's too high. we're going to release insulin from your pancreas. Insulin's going to tell your fat cells, let's soak that up. We're going to convert it to a triglyceride, and we're going to save it for a rainy day. Right? And in America, that works fantastically well. About 37% of us are now obese because of this mechanism on the right. Right? All right, so to take all that together, we accumulate that excess energy as fat cells. That's the point of cattle feeding. To feed an animal past its maintenance requirements, where the excess energy is stored as fat and the animal becomes finished to reach a market readiness, i.e. choice in our system. The unique thing about fat is when you fill up a fat cell, you get a new fat cell. So both hypertrophy and hyperplasia occur in fat cells. Every time I fill up a new fat cell, or every time I fill up an old fat cell, I get a new one. And then when I fill that one up, I get a new one. And then when I fill that one up, I get a new one. So fat increases at an increasing rate, and hyperplasia helps that system because I keep getting new fat cells as I get older and fatter. All right, to show where this is, and I believe one of you asked this question last night. Beef cattle, and let me paraphrase this, beef type cattle. So these next 4 slides really follow beef type cattle. Dairy type are in a different order. And I kind of went over that a little bit last night, but I'll go in more depth now. So beef type cattle, the number one storage depot is intramuscular fat, fat between the muscles. And this is a slice taken just behind the neck in the front of the shoulder. And you can see large depots of fat here, large depots of fat. Those are intramuscular fat depots, fat between muscles. That's where most of the fat in a beef animal is stored. The second most predominant is subcutaneous fat. We typically think of that as back fat, and that's true, it is back fat, but it's also side fat and it's also belly fat. It's everywhere under the skin. Second most predominant, and it's the easiest to measure. And so most countries that have a yield assessment, we call it a yield grade, measure the back fat because it's the easiest to consistently measure animal after animal. I want to take a quick side note here and discuss some data that Dr. John Breathauer published. Dr. Breathauer was an animal scientist at Kansas State University, and his life's work was in ultrasound. And Dr. Breathauer put a paper out in the Journal of Animal Science in 2000 that really summarized the growth of subcutaneous fat and another fat depot I'll get to in just a moment. And this context here is well taken on growth physiology of cattle. The point to take away is back fat grows in an exponential rate. Back fat grows at an exponential rate. And his point in the paper was, if I sorted 2 groups of cattle into those that were leaner, and he called it 2 millimeters of fat, and those that were fatter, he called it 4 millimeters of fat, the day they came into the feed yard, he modeled their growth curve. So the fatter they are at day 1, the fatter they're going to be when they leave the yard. The leaner they are at day 1, the leaner they're going to be when they leave the yard. That was his point of the paper.
On the same diet.
On the same diet. On the same diet, yes. At the same days on feed. So his point was we could sort cattle at arrival, something that feed yards call arrival sort, and we can get them into more homogeneous marketing groups, which the paper would clearly agree with. I use it as an illustration that, hey, back fat grows exponentially because all of his equations were exponential. And he's measuring these cattle serially with ultrasound. Yes, sir?
How accurate is the proxies?
How?
Accurate is these proxies to make?
I believe his R squares were in the 90s. highly accurate. The third most common or large depot of fat is intramuscular fat, that within the muscles. We call that marbling. So that's the basis of our U.S. quality grade system and several other countries as well. So I'm going to take another side note here. Marbling is highly driven by muscle fiber type. And I'm going to make some broad statements here, and I'm glad Joe left the room so he can't heckle me too much. We can categorize muscle into two broad categories: red muscles and white muscles. There are other categories in the middle, but I'm going to make some broad generalizations right now. A red muscle is shown here in the top left. That's the serratus ventralis muscle. That's right above the ribs, and it's a muscle that helps the animal pull their legs in toward the body. For those of you Americans that would be familiar with our beef checkoff system, we have, in the last 10 or so years, promoted that muscle as the Denver cut. If you've ever seen that at a restaurant, the Denver cut. So, very aerobic muscle. Lots of mitochondria, lots of myoglobin, and it is built for aerobic metabolism. The animal is constantly using that muscle every time they take a step. It's helping to hold the legs toward the center of the body. The body wants to put fat where it can be used aerobically. And the basic premise of that is you can't use fat without oxygen. So I'll ask you, how would you put out a grease fire? Smother it. Remove its source of oxygen. So the body wants to put fat where it can be used. Red muscle fibers are the appropriate location for fat stores. Okay? Red muscle fibers are the appropriate location for fat stores because they can be used as a source of energy aerobically. In contrast, white muscles have minimal mitochondria, as few myoglobin as can be gotten away with. Those muscles are much lighter red, even approaching pink in color in cattle, and they look differently because their physiology is different. A white muscle here, the whitest muscle in the bovine is the semitendinosus. We call that the eye of round in beef cuts. You'll never find a well-marbled semitendinosus, and I challenge you to go look for one. You won't find it because the animal doesn't want to put fat where it can't be used. And that's a very, very white muscle. So it's extremely lean, even in cattle that are prime, because it's a white muscle. And so it's not going to store fat there. It's not used in every step they make. It's more used in power movements when they need to generate tremendous amounts of force. So marbling is, again, highly influenced by muscle type. Now, which muscle do we look at for marbling to determine quality grade? Ribeye. The ribeye, that's right, or the longissimus. Yeah. The longissimus we would call an intermediate muscle. It has a nice blend of both white and red fibers. And so if an animal tends to be more white, it's going to have lower marbling. If an animal tends to be more red, it's going to have higher marbling. Okay, back to Dr. Breathauer's work. So when he was measuring all that back fat with his ultrasound, he was also measuring the marbling with his ultrasound. And in the same paper, he divides marbling three ways. Those that started out at traces 50, slight 0, and slight 50 the day they entered the feed yard. The same outcomes occur. The more marbling an animal has at day 0, the more it will have when it's marketed, and so on and so forth. The takeaway I'll ask you to write down: marbling grows or accrues at what we call a power curve. a power curve. A power curve is a slower accrual rate than exponential or back fat. And so if you're trying to feed to a particular quality, let's say low choice or premium choice, or you're trying to feed to prime, you're always going to add back fat at a faster rate than you're adding marbling. So last night, I know some of the Americans heard me say this, we now have a better chance of having a prime carcass than we do of having a yield grade 1 carcass by 2%. You have a better chance of having a prime than you do a yield grade 1 because we have pushed quality so far. Animals are now fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter, and we're reducing the number of yield grade 1 cattle in our population. The last fat depot is the internal fat. And I know this is probably one of the biggest variances amongst all the countries is what is done with this on the kill floor. So I can say in the United States, we're going to leave the last 3, the kidney, the pelvic, and the heart fat. We are going to remove the omental fat and the mesenteric fat as part of the gutting process. There are tremendous caloric stores of fat around the mesentery of the small and large intestine and around the rumen. Millions and millions of calories are stored there that are not they don't stay with the carcass, and fundamentally they don't go into food production. At least in America, when that animal is gutted, it has yet to be inspected and passed. And all of that fat by law must be declared inedible. And so all of that fat goes to inedible rendering. I might presume similar rules and regulations in many other countries.
You say it's why beef genetics? You say this order in the...
Yes, that's beef genetics.
For male and female is the same thing?
For male and female, it's the same. So beef type genetics, I'm referring to Angus, Hereford, Shorthorn, Chianina, Limousin, Brahman, Charolais, Salers. Fundamentally, most of the genetics you would be using in your countries. What I'm not referring to are dairy type genetics. In the dairy animal, the number 1 fat store is internal fat. Internal fat. Then intermuscular fat or seam fat. Then marbling, and the last is back fat. The order is completely changed in a dairy animal, and we've done that by selecting for milk yield. The internal fat is very easy to assist the mammary gland in energy and in high milk yield, and by selecting for milk yield, we inherently selected for different orders of fat deposition. Good question. So let's move to bone growth now. Early in the animal's life, the most important thing is to be able to nurse the mother. So the first bone that must mature and function is the skull and the jaw. After that animal is able to nurse the mother, it must be able to stay with the mother. So the second most important bones to develop are the appendicular skeleton. We'll call those the legs. That animal has to stay with its mother and roam the country, whatever that might be. You know, it could be a small paddock, it could be 10 sections of pasture. That animal has to be able to roam with mother. After that, we've got a vertebral column, or the axial skeleton, and that will be the next to grow. One thing that I do want to point out in the axial skeleton, that animal will mature, it will ossify from the back to the front. And this is kind of a unique premise in growth physiology. So let me draw a horrible steer here. An artist I am not. Okay, tail. So ossification yes. Perfect. Better markers. That's exactly what I needed, a better marker. Ossification occurs from the back to the front. So an animal ossifies starting at its sacral vertebrae, and then its lumbar vertebrae, and then its thoracic vertebrae, and finally its cervical vertebrae. From the back to the front. In contrast, fat growth occurs from the front to the back. An animal deposits fat in the chuck long before it does in the round. And so we're accruing fat growth from front to back, ossification from back to front, and I can also say fat occurs fundamentally from top to bottom. They accrue fat up high on their body prior to accruing fat low in the body. So another premise of growth is that an animal gets taller, you got taller, one cell at a time. So if we were to look at the bones, at the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate, and you look at the epiphyseal plate under a microscope, you'll see small cells, and you stack one cell on top of the other. And you got taller, one layer of cells at a time, and on the bottom side of these cells, they're ossifying, controlled by what hormone? Estrogen. So estrogen is ossifying the cells on the bottom, and you're stacking a new layer of chondrocytes on the top, and they continue to ossify until the bone is closed. And at some point, everyone in here reached a peak of estrogen, even the gentleman. Now, even though you weren't generating large amounts of estrogen naturally, you were generating large amounts of testosterone. Testosterone is aromatized to estrogen in males. And everyone reached a point at which they had a peak level of estrogen that caused senescence of bone growth plates. This is widely exhibited in heifers when you have a heifer that gets pregnant at a young age. Okay, if you've experienced cow-calf operations and you had a young heifer get bred early in her life, maybe at 500 or 600 pounds, she will be the shortest statured heifer in the herd if you keep her, because her bone growth plates closed at a young age, right? What closed her bone growth plates at that early age weren't so much the ovaries, it was actually the placenta. The placenta, as part of its growth, produces copious amounts of estrogen. And it shut off her bone growth plates, and that's why an early bred heifer remains short in her stature. In the mid-90s, Dr. Ray Field published a paper, again in the Journal of Animal Science, that highlighted this concept. Dr. Field had taken a small group of heifers from the University of Wyoming cattle herd, and he divided them into three groups. The first group were spayed. So they were what we call an overectomized heifer. Their ovaries had been removed. So they would have gone in either vaginally or above the flank, made a slit through the skin, reached in, cut the ovary, removed it, sewed or stitched her up. She is now an overectomized heifer. She has no source of estrogen. 1/3 of the heifers remained intact but virgin, so they were never exposed to a bull. And 1/3 of the heifers were exposed to a bull, bred, allowed to carry the calf to term, allowed to raise the calf to weaning. While these cows were in gestation and carrying the calf at their side, These other two groups were in an adjacent pasture together to control the type of forage and the environmental conditions and make those as homogeneous as possible. After these cows had weaned their calf, they're all put into a feedlot together. They're fed the same number of days. They die on the same day. So his outcome was primarily, what is the maturity of these three divergent groups based on the quantity of estrogen their body would have received? So the spayed heifers were young, fundamentally. 17 of them were A maturity, no B maturities, 1 C maturity. I have spayed heifers once in my life. It's reaching your hand into a dark place, and I bet they missed an ovary. That'd be my guess. Okay? The virgin heifers were younger than the single calf cows, but older than the spayed heifers. And so you got to realize that every 21 days that heifer went through estrus. And so there's a peak and a valley, and a peak and a valley. Every 21 days there would have been a spike of estrogen coursing through her body, and that would have increased her bone maturity. And then the single calf cow, the table is flipped now. We still have 4 that are A, but the majority have advanced to C maturity. The same thing that we showed you last night in our Corriente heifer. And you'll see that in the meat lab today. An older animal, more advanced skeletal maturity. So that's an illustration that bone physiology is driven by one hormone.
In the teeth is the same?
The teeth, they should have been the same. This was prior, this research and the publication, prior to dentition becoming important. And I don't know, but my premise would be they would have not even looked at it in that day. Okay, a little bit about growth rate and nutrition. So there are priorities in the body. The first priority is the nervous tissue and the organs, simply to maintain life. The body has to continue, so we're going to put highest priority on nervous tissue and organs, the head, and the internal fat. Even in a cull cow, internal fat will still be there. She will have wasted away other fat depots before she gets rid of her internal fat. That is one of the last storage depots to go. A second priority would be the bones, the forequarter area in general, the front of the animal, and the intramuscular fat. The third priority would be the muscles, the hindquarter, and the subcutaneous fat. And the lowest priority is the intramuscular fat, or the marbling. And I said last night, and I'll repeat it today, if an animal becomes ill and has a nutritional challenge, a nutritional crisis in its life, the first energy source it's going to use is marbling, or the intramuscular fat. And so if you have ill cattle in your system, they will grade lower, poorer, lesser in marbling than an animal that was never sick. Okay? I can say the same for growth rate and sex of an animal. Sex of an animal determines fundamentally the rate of muscle versus fat and bone growth. And as shown in these charts, muscle growth is driven first by a steer, first by a bull, second by a steer, third by a heifer. So we get back to muscle fibers. A bull and a steer are going to have the same number of muscle fibers, and that number is greater than a heifer. So they're going to have more opportunity for muscle growth. Fat growth is just the reverse. As you would know, a heifer matures at a lighter weight and an earlier time or an earlier age than a steer. So a heifer has earlier fat growth than a steer, than an intact male or a bull. Growth rate is also controlled largely by genetic type. And so I've got two contrasting types here, an Angus versus a Holstein. An Angus would mature or reach its market potential at a lighter weight. And a Holstein would reach its market potential at a heavier weight. And they're two different statures. We could also say there's two different frame scores between those animals, the lighter weight and the heavier weight. There's also two different fat quantities. When the Angus reaches its maturity, it will be fatter than when the Holstein reaches its maturity. It will be leaner. Real briefly, a little bit about empty body and the empty body measures. I showed this last night, and what I want to say is a common outcome is to push an animal until it has reached an empty body fat. We commonly say that an empty body fat of 28.6 allows the animal to reach its genetic potential for choice, USDA choice. And we measure this by taking an animal and determining its body composition. So take an animal and drain it of its blood and remove all of the ingesta and fundamentally drop it in a grinder. And what is the composition of the remaining empty body of that animal? If we look at this slide here, I get back to the same thing I had previously. An Angus heifer matures earlier than an Angus steer that matures earlier than an Angus bull. If I add this layer of Holsteins in, the Holstein heifer matures earlier than the Holstein steer, matures earlier than the Holstein bull. And there's significant divergence in those lines. It would be difficult to feed a Holstein bull to market readiness or choice. You might not want to do that. Or you might be surprised at the weight it would take to get him there. Okay? Muscle and fat are antagonists. I mentioned that last night. I'll say it again. And so I'm going to let you absorb that for just a minute. The chart on the lower, or the x-axis here, is in millimeters of subcutaneous fat. The y-axis is in percentile. So an animal has a accruance of choice or greater as it gets fatter and fatter and fatter. So we can see from 4 millimeters of back fat, we would have a probability of 20% of an animal being choice. And as we move to the right, we get to about 14 millimeters of back fat, and we have an inflection point in the line. Well, I could call it almost linear from 4 to 14, and then an inflection point from 14 to 26. There are about 2 lines there. You remember back to my comment, marbling grows at a power curve. That's shown here in a little different format in this data right here. As cattle get fatter and fatter and fatter at the back, they slow down how much change occurs in quality grade, this being measured by choice or better. Also, as animals get fatter and fatter and fatter, the probability of a yield grade 1 or 2 diminishes. And the probability of a yield grade 4 and 5 increases. I could take that same data and look at it in terms of muscle. So in the x-axis, I have loin muscle area in centimeter square ranges. So as an animal gets heavier and heavier and heavier muscled, the probability of choice and better declines. The probability of a yield grade 1 or 2 increases. The probability of a yield grade 4 or 5 also declines. So we can take basic growth physiology and with some knowledge predict where an animal would end up in its quality and its yield. I can also convert that to units of muscle per a given weight. Loin muscle area per weight unit. That kind of corrects for big animals versus small animals. This is much more representative of what we would typically do. So as I've corrected for loin muscle per weight, now we have a nice linear line of choice or better. Choice decreases as an animal gets heavier and heavier and heavier muscled because muscle and fat are antagonists. We would rarely find a limousine steer that grades choice. There's just too much muscle mass there. In contrast, you would rarely find a Jersey steer that didn't grade choice or prime because the limited muscle mass promotes increased fat growth. I didn't plan on talking about implants. Give me just a moment here. Let me see what we got here. I guess that is the right one here. How are we doing? All right, I'll mention this real quickly. We control the additional growth of an animal by providing exogenous hormone. So in American production, we remove the testes of an animal and we remove the testosterone production. We typically don't overectomize a heifer unless they came across the Mexican border. Most other heifers would never be spayed. So we add exogenous hormones to those animals. Namely, an estrogenic early on in our history. We developed estrogenic type implants in the 1950s. Originally they were fed and then they were compressed into a pelleted form that could be put into the ear. The original estrogenic types were made from estradiol 17 beta, and then because of patent protection, some other companies made a similar product. They used the benzoic acid. You would know that as estradiol benzoate on a label. And if you follow the quantity, it takes more estradiol benzoate to equal estradiol 17 beta because estradiol benzoate is about 80% as effective as 17 beta. So you'll see a little different quantity to have equivalent outcome. Sinovex C, S, Compudos, and Encore would all be the pioneer brands in estradiol. And then a Fusarium corn mold was found to contain zeranolone, and Zeranol was built out of that corn mold. We don't get it from corn mold today. It's made in a lab. In fact, I think they're having trouble just making it anymore and getting it produced. I don't think you can find raw grow in the market right now, but I have been told it will come back someday. Fundamentally, all of these compounds do these things right here. Number one, they increase production of somatotropin. Somatotropin you would know as growth hormone. So I could say bovine growth hormone would be bovine somatotropin. Human growth hormone would be human somatotropin. Okay, so we have an increase in growth hormone, and we have a decrease in somatostatin. Somatostatin is growth hormone inhibitor. So if we have more hormone and less inhibitor, then we have some growth effects. We have documented, as have many other people, an increase in pituitary gland and weight, size and weight. We have an experiment going on right now here on campus where my graduate students have cattle on an implant and cattle that are NHTC, non-implanted. And there is a difference in size and weight of the pituitary gland. It's almost to the point where you can see it now, and they've been able to weigh it for several kills. There's also an increase in insulin-like growth factor 1 produced by the liver. So we have more hormone being produced by the liver, and the net effect is more protein synthesis, but a constant rate of protein degradation, also known as protein turnover. So the body is breaking down the same amount of protein every day, but building up a faster rate. In the 1980s, Anabolic growth hormones were generated, namely TBA, trenbolone acetate. TBA is a synthetic testosterone, approximately 10 times more potent than testosterone, primarily because it has a longer half-life, much longer half-life than testosterone. So it's active longer in the muscle receptors. We're going to notice with TBA we get reduced cortisol levels. Back to my cow that was in catabolism, cortisol is a hormone that breaks down body components. If we decrease the level of cortisol, we'll have less breakdown of body components. More IGF-1, again produced by the liver, and this level gets similar to that of a bull. And we get more satellite cells and a greater rate of fusion of the satellite cells in the muscle. Satellite cells provide the framework for new protein to be accrued in the muscle. Fundamentally, they provide the blueprint for muscle cell growth. So the unique thing about these are, hey, we get more protein synthesis and less degradation. So the animal retains more of its original protein and it accrues more protein. This product, the pioneer at least, was only ever known as Phenoplex S and H. And then later, the current state of technology, starting in about the early 90s and continuing through today and even into the future, is combination implants. So we have an estradiol component and we have a trenbolone acetate component. And they work synergistically, or they work better together than they would alone. And so you get additive effects. And the net effect, beyond those that I showed at the other slides, we'll get an increase in metabolizable energy. So the animal is able to utilize more of the feed energy that it takes in. We get less heat production. So less heat energy goes into the environment. More heat energy is retained in the body as tissue mass. More protein accretion and less lipid accretion. This has been shown multiple times in the published literature. Yes?
The estrogen is responsible by ossification.
Yes?
The implant of estrogen is running the ossification like the natural estrogen or not?
So it will cause ossification, but minimal. So the quantity that we would put in the ear might be, let's say, 40 milligrams of estrogen in the ear, and it's in a slow, almost controlled release, a very slow release. So the bloodstream is breaking down the pellet, if you will, dissolving the pellet, and that estrogen is slowly over time being let into the bloodstream. If we quantify the literature, the published literature, and we compared cattle that never received an implant to those that received an estrogenic type implant, we see about a 10-degree shift in ossification or bone maturity. So if a control animal was A50, we would expect the treated animals to be about A60. So 10 degrees is about what the published literature says that we see. So it does occur, but it's not a huge change. There's just not enough estrogen that's put into that pellet.
Yeah.
Okay?
Thank you.
Good. So we went over this last night. I'll let this go and real briefly get into what the implant does to carcass weight. So by and large, we're going to see more hot carcass weight. We're going to see a little bit fatter animal, primarily because implanted animals tend to have a greater intake, particularly from the estrogenic component. We're going to see a larger ribeye area. We've caused more protein accretion to occur. We're going to see a little bit less KPH fat in an implanted animal. And I'll get into quality grading real quick here. We're going to see a little bit less marbling. because we've told the body to accrue protein and slow down marbling quantity. And then in quality grading, the maturity component, we're going to see a shift in bone maturity. Back to this gentleman's question. The literature says, again, about 10 degrees of change is what we would expect from the estrogen component of the implant. Then if I get into what does it do to tenderness, we're going to see a little bit tougher meat, a little bit less soft, more resistance. We would say this is probably minuscule, and I say that because it typically takes about half a kilo for a human to detect. And the difference we're talking about here is 0.2 kilos. So it's probably not detectable by most humans. And then if we look at a sensory panel outcome, the sensory panel would show slight decreases in acceptability or overall tenderness of an implanted animal. Okay? An implant lengthens the growth curve by making an animal heavier and older at its finish. Back to empty body fat real quick. An implant lengthens the growth curve and makes an animal heavier and older at its time of finish, and also more efficient at its time of finish. So this chart here illustrates, back to empty body fat, something that many of you might be quite familiar with. If we feed an animal, again, to 28.6% empty body fat, we would say that it should have the ability to reach low choice. And I showed you some pictures like this last night with cattle. So what I want to say is an implant pushes that empty body fat down the road to a heavier weight at a longer time. And Pablo Giroy published a paper a few years ago that really illustrated this very well and tracked it back to implant potency. So he illustrated that an animal with no implant, we would call that an NHTC, would achieve 28.6% empty body fat, or choice, at about 1,145 pounds. If you gave that animal one, we would call that kind of a low-dose intermediate implant, Revelor IS, it would need to weigh 38 more pounds to reach the same compositional endpoint. So these animals are now at the same percentage empty body fat, and they're the same compositionally. The implanted animal had to be fed longer for more days to a heavier weight to reach the same composition. A more potent implant, Revelor S, would need more days at a heavier weight. Now that animal needs an additional 67 pounds. If an animal was given two implants, a Revelor IS followed by a Revelor S, today that would be known as Revelor XS in a one-dose implant, they had to be 79 pounds heavier. And if they were given two Revelor S's, they had to almost be 100 pounds heavier. So the point being, the more potent the hormone dose put into the animal, the heavier they need to be and the longer they need to be on feed to reach the same compositional endpoint. Okay, I'll make one comment about marbling, and then I think we're wrapping this up. If we feed a non-implanted animal to a constant weight or time, it will always have more marbling and be more well finished than an implanted animal. Because the implanted animal, we've changed its growth curve. It has a bigger frame score. It has a new finished weight that is heavier and more days on feed. However, if we feed an animal to the same empty body fat, they'll be the same marbling score.